In this video, we're going to finish up our website header. So what's left to do here is the as-seen-on part, so this part here. And in fact, we're going to use two grids for that. The first one is this one here. So what you see here is in fact a small grid, but let's start with the one to lay out these four items here. And again, I'm going to use the CSS grid here instead of Flexbox, because I find it so easy to use the column gap instead of having to mess with the right margins or something like that. Okay, so here on the Scene On logos, we display this as a grid with four equally sized columns. So template, columns, repeat, 4, and then 1 fractional unit for each of them. And then we want a gap between them of 3 rem. So let's check that out. And alright, so that looks much better already. Now let's just center each of them here inside of their grid cell. And so we're going to use justify items, set to center, of course. And now one last thing that I want to do with these images is to make them slightly darker. Okay, so here you have them like in this color, and so it looks like as if they were a bit gray, such as the text here, instead of being this white, which really catches your attention. And we don't want that. And so we can use a filter, and the one I'm looking for is brightness, and I'm going to set it to 70%. So 100% is the default, and if we set it to anything less than 70%, the image gets darker, and if we set it to something above 100%, the image gets lighter, of course. Okay, and so yeah, so that's the change that you just saw here. So that's this part, and now let's talk about the Scene On part. And as I mentioned, we're going to use a grid here as well. But probably now you're wondering, well, we don't even have any grid items. How are we going to use a grid here for that? So let's take a look at our HTML. And in fact, this element here, it does only have this text here. So it doesn't even have any child element, which could be a grid item, right? But in fact, that's not correct, because even text can be treated as a grid item. And so if I set this element here to a grid container, then the Scene On text here will be one of the grid items. So again, even text can be a grid item. And what can also be grid items are pseudo elements. And so the trick here is to use one before pseudo element and one after pseudo element to create the two lines that we see here. So these two lines. And so basically this here will be one of the grid items, and the other grid item is this line here, which is a before pseudo element, and this line here is an after pseudo element. And so our three grid items will be these three. Okay, so that's a completely different application of CSS grid, and so I wanted to show you that as well, and that's why I included this small part here in this project. Okay, so we set this here to display grid, and before doing any grid definitions, let's quickly style the text here. So font size 1.6 rem, and the color is the darker light gray. So color gray light and the darker version, so the number 1. All right, and now let's take care of the before and after pseudo elements. So before and after. And remember that these two here, together with the text, will be the three grid items. And as always, we have to define the content property, even if we set it to empty, but without it, this is not going to work. Then we set its height to 1 pixel. We also set it to display as a block. And then we give it a background color. And instead of just copying this color from here, we can use the current color variable, right? Remember this one? So what this does is that it takes the current text color, so the one defined in the color property, and simply uses that one. And so instead of having to write the duplicate color gray light 2 here again, I can use the current color keyword, and that's then going to use this color. And if I change this one, then of course this one changes automatically. And so it's a great addition to CSS, this keyword, this variable. So let's take a look at what happens on the page, and keep in mind that we didn't specify any width here. And so that's probably going to have some effect on that. And all right, it now stretched it across the entire container here. And so let's actually take a look at that here. So yeah, so this is our grid. And you see down here that it basically has just one row, but in fact it has more than that, okay, because it also contains these 1 pixel height lines, right? So we can see that here that it actually goes from 1 to 4. So by default, CSS Grid always places its items in rows, right? But instead we want columns. So we want 3 columns, 1 for the line, then after that we want the text here, the scene on text, and then we want the other line. And so let's define our columns. So grid template columns, and the first one is 1FR, so taking the remaining space. Then the one in the middle is max content, okay? And let me actually try min content here to show you what happens. And then the last one is 1FR as well. So we want the left and the right side to be the same, occupying all the remaining space, and then the text in the middle. So let's take a look at that. And that's what I meant with the min and max content. So right now this is a breaking here into a new line, and that's exactly what min content means. And so what I want here is max content. And so that's what it looks like. Now just 2 more things that we need to add here, which is the space between these columns, so the gap, and then also vertically align these 3 items. So grid column gap, let's say 15 pixels, and then just vertically align these elements. And that should be it. And yeah, that's it. So that's just the same as our initial version, right? Now, of course, the spacing here is different, and that's because we have these dev tools here. And so let's actually see the effect of different viewports on the layout here. Okay, so this is what happens when we change the viewport height. So basically where the space decreases is exactly in the rows where we defined 1FR as the size of the row track. So remember, it's this one here and this one. Let's actually turn that on. So the header. And so now you will start seeing how these rows increase, right? So this one and this one. And that's exactly what I meant in the beginning when I said that we were going to have very dynamic spacing here in a vertical direction in this component. So what CSS Grid allowed us here to do is to add this dynamic spacing here, which changes very easily with the viewport height. And all that because of the power of the fractional unit, right? So that's what allows us to have this behavior where when we change this viewport height, so the height of the container, then this part here stays at the bottom and we want this stays at the top, and all that changes is the size of these rows. Basically this part here stays at the middle. Okay, and so once again we used some advanced tools and concepts here in CSS Grid to achieve exactly what we want. And so with that, you have now the tools to create something similar for your own pages. So of course, I don't want you to do the exact same thing, and that's what I always say, because really I teach you this so that you can have the tools, but not that you can copy exactly what I do here. So always be creative and use these tools for your own layouts and designs. All right, and with that, all there's left to do now is to actually create this missing parse here. So this missing piece, which is the top 3 realtors. And then of course, we're going to make all of this responsive. But for now, as for the layout, all that's missing is this part here.